Right, so this is the panel, Did We Just Become Friends? A Design and Development Story. I'm Jason, but I'm not one of the panelists, but I'll be moderating. We got our times mixed up with our moderator. And also Kyle Fiedler wanted to be here, but was having some illness in his family. So well, I'll let the three panelists we have introduce themselves. Grab the mic right there and flip the switch up to turn it on.
Can you hear me? There we go. Hello. My name is Matt McManus. I am co-founder of a small startup called OwnersUp. I've also worked here at PromptWorks, and I worked with Jeff. I wish you could have been here. But yeah, I'm responsible for design and implementation of all the technical aspects of our startup. It's just two of us, so I'm pretty busy.
Hi, I'm Helene Speer. I'm a front-end developer with Brownstone. I'm on a long-term, semi-permanent client engagement at Comcast. So much of my experience that I'll be talking about today is not pertinent to the environment at Brownstone, but rather in the specific division of Comcast that I work with. So I lead a development team there. And that development team from Brownstone is part of a much larger development team that works with many web properties. So,
how you doing? My name is Andrew Croce. I am a UI UX designer here at PromptWorks. I've been here about 6 months, but I've been doing web design and application design for several years. My background is in the arts and in logic and front-end programming, so I bring the new full-time position of UX designer to PromptWorks. So this is, we've been expanding that branch of our services.
So what does design mean where you're at? Because it can have many definitions. What does it mean?
To me, design ultimately means solving problems. It's easy, I think, to get caught up in certain techniques or styles or this or that, whatever popular process might be at any given moment. But ultimately, it's about figuring out what the problems are that a person or user base is having and doing research and learning to figure out what the solutions to those are. The implementation of those solutions is almost secondary to that, I think. But it's really about problem solving, I think.
So I definitely agree with that and would add that the implementation, which is generally where we come in, is another kind of design. Our end user can be considered to be the end user of the software, but we're also designing for the user of the implementation, which might be business users, other developers, and we have to design a system that we can use to implement the system that you're designing.
Yeah, I like that distinction. I think I was thinking about this morning, the types of design processes and stages, and I was fascinated from the Mike's talk because a lot of what I'm doing right now is design is very much quick and focused, and what questions can I answer to get what I'm trying to build out the door as quickly as possible? Because there's a million questions I could answer. What's the most specific problem I can design a solution to and get out? Whereas with Mike, the layers of stakeholders, and so it definitely changes a lot. So I've been fascinated by how much constraints affect your design process and your design priorities, because those are very fluid based off your situation and the resources you have to be able to actually design well.
So how do projects flow at your company? Matt, I know you're a company of two, so it flows pretty well. But
right, it's unfortunately all up here, so it flows without very clear stages and distinctions. So my business partner's the business and my business side of stuff, and we're coaching software basically, and she's the coaching part and I'm the technical part.
How about previous?
So for me, the flow, as much as possible, tries to be focused on simplicity. Like, what if we've got this thing we want to try to address? Like, because we have such clear and really tight constraints, it's what is the simplest solution to this? And usually it's a small component that has isolated interactions. It's very tight and it's very specific, and it fits in one little small part of the site. For that the larger systems take a lot more time, and for me, I let it mull. Like if we're doing a redesign, we're doing a big sweep of something, because I'm messing with the technical implementation, the infrastructure implementation, and really what is the user going to interact with. I tend to think, for me, the subconscious, or as I call it, the professor. And I let the professor work on stuff over time. Like how will this evolve as new problems come up or new feedback arises? So it doesn't make any sense in my head, and it probably didn't make sense to you.
So at the client where I am working right now, the design process is not very transparent to us. There is a very long process of collaboration between business and UX. The end result being a visual that sort of comes into grooming, and we often see it for the first time. This has been a problem for us throughout. So I would not want to use this experience as sort of a guide to what people should be doing. We've made some inroads. We're starting to see things a little earlier. We haven't gotten yet to the point where our seeing things earlier have allowed us to make change. No, our process still does not go both ways.
No, I think to Matt's point, and the fact that Matt and I are both on relatively small teams makes that kind of situation a lot less predominant. So our process, we work in an agile environment, so we try to think in iterations, what goes with what Matt was saying, trying to address the smallest possible feature set at a given time. I think that allows you to focus. It allows for a lot more communication between designers and developers, and including them in that design process, I think, is key. So it's unfortunate that there are scenarios where that doesn't happen, but getting the input of our developers, I can't imagine how I would design without it. You don't want to end up going down a path and having a huge set of design deliverables to find out, this is not possible, this is going to be out of scope, etc. So having them involved at all stages of that is key, I think. To what Matt was saying, I like the idea of breaking down each feature into a small design problem. Certainly, at the outset of a project, there's going to be a little bit more upfront design, focusing on some stylistic things which we want to set patterns for and define everything. But narrowing the scope for each iteration, each cycle, allows you to really focus on the problem at hand and come up with the solutions without losing the overall story. So, yeah.
Got a question, because it goes right with this. How do you guys, what would be the perfect synergy, that's a nice word, of developer and designer? Like, what is that, what in your experience, what do you hope for as far as a healthy, constructive, effective working relationship between processes that tend to be distinct? Like you said, there's this design part and it's devoid of input or feedback or understanding by the developers.
As a UI developer, what I really would like to see is a focus on interaction design pattern. When we're lucky enough to get a style guide, they're usually visual styles. What I'd like to see is a discussion of what happens, how does a user interact with this interface? What are they expected to do with the data, and what does that look like? And that might mean, I've been doing a bunch of reading on how to help our designers give us what we need so that we can stop sort of churning. And one of the things that we need is states. I've seen articles that say that there are 3 states, 5 states, 9 states. There are a lot of states.
9 is the recent one.
The recent one is 9. So I'm used to getting 1. Or there's this idea that each feature is sort of its own distinct, right, this own distinct experience. I would like to sit down with a designer and say, how does a person interact with any interface in this application? How do you change any piece of data? So if you're changing your call forwarding number, is that really a different butterfly than changing your mobility number? Or even your billing address?
Yeah, I think what you're saying points to, again, a lack of communication in that process where you're planning out these states. And one of the things that I like to do is something called object mapping at the beginning. And I think this is something that can involve designers, developers, and stakeholders for that matter, where outside of the UI, you're looking at what are the objects, what are the things in the system that a user needs to change or do something with, what are the actions that they can take on those objects, and then we can say, okay, what are the views we need to create in order to make those things happen? So if you do that first, without even thinking about what it looks like, everyone involved now has a kind of a mental model of what the application should do. So the idea of states and things, those, you can't ignore them now because you have that deeper understanding of the system. To Matt's question about, what's your ideal scenario, I think the ideal scenario was where each member of a team, designers, engineers, product owners, whoever, project managers, are all willing to overlap with the other disciplines a little bit, willing to learn about what everyone else is doing, and not so kind of walled up in their own silo. Yeah, I've worked on teams where that happens, and obviously about what happens when there's too much siloing. And I've also had great relationships with engineers where we kind of start to learn the other one's language, and you begin to anticipate the objections or the suggestions they're going to make, and it allows you to kind of build a relationship and go deeper and become a better team. So to me, it's about willingness to learn what everyone else is doing and not wall yourself up. So.
Some like amens or something, if you guys are like agreeing with this, or like I'm curious what your thoughts are, and especially you, Jason. One of the projects I did here with PromptWorks was a big redesign for a large virtual hosting platform, and going into that process, I don't know if everyone here is more backend developer, right? Whatever it is, like we use Bootstrap, and for me coming into that as a kind of a designer, like that was like the default WordPress theme of the internet. Like, please, we should be more creative and craftsperson-y to do something unique and original. But by the end of that project, I loved it, and it goes to what you're saying of like having a defined component library, and the value there being, we have this set of things that we have names for that are reusable, like a panel or a side menu or a top nav, even though they're ugly in Bootstrap, or just default, not necessarily ugly, but default. I had a lot of fun taking away the bootstrappiness and making it something unique, but still having this set language and this set glossary for what these things are, and so that for the developers to be able to say, okay, this is a panel, I need to pull a panel in here, and I I don't have any questions about what that is, and I don't have any questions about what that will look like when it's done. And so having that sort of defined component library as being part of the design deliverable is felt like it's just something I've mulled over as something really valuable. And even though like you don't have to use Bootstrap, but that's nice because you don't have to figure out the language; it's defined. But I found that to be really, really effective for me as a designer to be able, like, okay, this is a new feature. I have these constraints. I'm going to fit them into the patterns that we're using everywhere else, and there's not going to be tons of back and forth with the developer implementing it, being like, well, what happens here, or actually I don't know how to do this, or just the stalling that happens when you have 1,000 questions. So that's been super for me.
We've had really good experiences doing the same thing. Our interactions are all custom, and so we can't use Bootstrap. But what we've pretty much done is try to create our own using, we looked at a bunch of tools. We ended up with pattern labs. So we'll get these patterns from the designers, talk to them about it, and implement a pattern which any of the .NET developers can take and use. So there were a number of things that it helped us with. One is consistency. We were getting a lot of new designs where some things were just slightly different. And there would be a process of either somebody writing more CSS in order to account for this difference, which we didn't understand what it was for, or we'd go back and say, should this actually be different? Now, they might give us, instead of a visual for everything, which was very time-consuming for them. It was terrible, for them. And then we would insist on these red lines. So we had a new red line for every page. And if the numbers weren't exactly the same, instead of adding information, it was actually taking it away. It was actually giving us more work being less useful. Now the designers could give us even a drawing on a napkin that says we're going to have one of these and one of these, and then one of these. And we can go ahead and build using that. So it keeps the designers from doing a lot of needless extra work that actually provides more confusion than clarity. And it helps us go faster.
Yeah, I definitely emphasize the idea that it helps you move faster. It's almost accelerating because even whether you're using Bootstrap or Foundation or rolling your own, whatever library of patterns that you have, with each time you create a new pattern, now you don't have to think about it so much anymore. So each problem you're solving now comes with a set of tools that are going to hopefully fit what you're doing. And when you have these, huge design deliverables that keep coming, and someone clearly didn't realize they almost solved the same problem over here, why didn't you just use the same thing? Not only does it make it, like you said, more work for the designer who didn't really think about it and now had to create a whole new set of mock-ups, but now the front-end engineers and the back-end engineers have to build something different to accommodate those different patterns, and it just kind of multiplies the complexity, whereas when you use these patterns, it does the opposite. The complexity kind of eases down until you have a nice, clean set of patterns that are just easily implemented.
This is my bugaboo, so I just have to keep talking. Sure. I'll try to stop. But another thing that's really good about it is that it helps us help the designers by challenging the designers to create rules for development. So when we have two visual or interaction patterns that really provide the same thing, we have to go back and we have to say, do we need these both? And if we do, what are the rules for when you use one or the other? What do we call these things? And if you don't know what to call it, and you don't know why there were two, you don't know what it is, and you don't know why it's there. It's been more than a year since a designer has said to us, it just looks better this way here. We've eliminated that by using this kind of technique that allows us to talk about the design. It becomes a vocabulary.
So you touched on a little bit what developers can do to make designers' lives easier and how that can kind of feed. We often think of design then feeding toward development, but working the opposite way, how developers can help the designers. So what are some other ways developers can help designers have better design or have design that can be used more easily?
Well, just like I was saying about willingness to learn about what engineers and what other people do, I think there has to be a willingness the other way to learn a little bit of design principles and internalize some of those concepts. Designers, at least good designers, make decisions based on principles, make decisions based on well-established, I don't want to call them rules, but things that you do for certain reasons that have a long history of best practices, or more principles, and making an attempt to understand those principles and the fact that good designers don't just do things because they look good, but because they work and because it's going to ultimately make the end user's life easier, and trying to remember those things. I think that goes a long way in making our jobs easier, I think.
Matt, any thoughts on that?
I mean, this is not a very sexy one, but it's just making room for that back and forth. I think part of the problem is when there's a conflict, like when the design and the development are separate and at odds. Like, it just stinks. Like, no, you're not going to be able to. I was wondering, like, you have clout to be able to influence what the designers have done, and that's part of the culture that allows you to make those changes so that there is that improvement. And so one of my questions I've been thinking about, and I think the answer is all of the above, but like, what really makes effective collaboration between design and development? Like, is it leadership? Is it process? Is it culture? Is it a person? Does it tend to revolve around a person who's able to do that? And probably it's yes to that, all those things. But I was curious if you guys have thoughts about really, like, is there something, can we say that there's something that causes that a healthy relationship between design development and leadership and all that? What does it revolve around? Whether it's, it feels like it needs to be like you need to have a person that's able to bridge that gap, that can lead there, that can help the leadership understand, that can help the developers understand. But that's rough. Like, it feels too. There has to be more than that. That's really probably a terrible question.
That's great.
I'm going to try for a one-word answer, and respect.
If I could add another word, communication. And I think those two things together, respectful communication, all the other things you were saying kind of tend to fall into in line when there's open communication, that we're talking in person as much as possible, sitting down together to actually collaborate and work together, and not just handing over a set of deliverables and going to the next project, but that there's an interaction on what's happening and talking. Yeah.
I'm sorry. I'm so excited.
That's great.
There's this process that that I started noticing a few years ago when I was working at the first UX consultancy that I was in. When designers document using wireframes or visuals, it's a process of encoding.
Mm-hmm.
You're encoding your ideas into some kind of a picture, and then the developers need to decode that. We're not recreating the picture, we're trying to recreate the design ideas behind the picture.
Mm-hmm.
And so then we have to decode your encoding, and then in the process of the implementation, we're actually re-encoding your design. And so the more that we can understand the motivation, the intention behind the design, the more our code will carry it out.
I think for me, because I'm both, and Matt as well, as front-end developer and designer, it's almost like that conversation is having on both sides of my brain. You know, as I'm designing, the front-end developer side of my head is saying, okay, how am I going to build this? How is this going to translate into a HTML, CSS module, or whatever it might be? So I almost wish I had more experience, not as a developer, so I can kind of try and think like that. But yeah, as I'm designing, I'm always thinking, so how's this going to work? So yeah. If we had a pure designer up here, they may be able to give us a
Right.
better answer.
Are you a pure designer?
I wish.
No.
No. We've got another question.
Sure. What small design decisions have big ramifications in development? Maybe it's kind of a tough one.
Anything that deviates.
Uh-huh.
And that's a shame because a designer once explained this to me. Tell me if I'm wrong about this, because I'm not an expert on design. But a designer said that a great design creates a grid and then breaks it. And breaking the grid is so sad for us. And then, or having something be slightly different because it's viscerally more appealing here. You know, those are the sorts of things that seem small. You know, 1 pixel here and there. Or even the fact that you're relying on something as small as a pixel when we can't really work that way anymore. You know, that has large repercussions on our workflow.
I think, yeah, a good baseline for everything is, like we were talking about patterns, having a similar way of doing everything, and not, you mentioned a grid, but not breaking those patterns without a really good reason for doing that. So if it's a disagreement at all, I would say breaking the grid is something you can do, but you have to have a fundamental understanding of the pattern to begin with before you break it, and have a really good reason to do it. For UX reasons, for style reasons, whatever, marketing reasons, whatever it might be. It's this principle that keeps coming back to me over and over the years, and it applies to the arts. It applies to almost every discipline, actually, if I could be so broad. But you have to know the rules before you can break them, and you have to really be a master of the rules before you have the right to change them. So it's kind of the same idea that, stick to the rules unless you really, really know why you're not. So.
Do you think there's any sort of historical and tooling reasons why designers so often make small deviations when they copy things over in, Photoshop or Illustrator? And how do you fight against that? How do you keep consistency across your design?
Well, there are definitely tools that we can use to help maintain those things. Things like Photoshop and Sketch have symbol and style libraries that help make that stuff. You don't have to think about it as much. But I guess a lack of education in that principle perhaps makes people think, maybe less experienced designers think, okay, well, this text looks better just a half a point size larger there. Well, no, that kind of blows things up, and it's better to stick to a kind of a rhythmic pattern there, or whatever the principle is. But certainly the tools allow us to make those kind of
Consistency things.
I think that the tooling is an interesting part, because I think over the last couple of years across the board on development side and design side, the tools have improved so much to eliminate, I think a lot of those deviations tend to be mentally inconsequential. You're dragging stuff around in Photoshop or Illustrator, and it doesn't have that sort of emphasis on patterns and own consistency. In the same way, like a lot of front end stuff now is like we can have tools do all the crappy work, like vendor prefixes and like I don't have to think. I can free my mind from all those things so that I can hold patterns. I can build a mental model, and that's effective on the design side and on the development side. And it feels like I started doing web design when it was still like tables and Dreamweaver and front page and all that, and you just kind of like, I remember one of the first things was like, oh, Dreamweaver lets you drag divs, and it would, in the background, it would absolutely position all these divs, and it had no concept of, it was just a nightmare in hindsight, but it was amazing. You could just do that, and because the tool enabled you to make really crappy designs in that regard. And now I think the world that we live in as developers and designers has matured a ton, specifically with the web, as the web has matured. I mean, it's still a baby, and it's just neat to see that maturity starting to show, and that it's freeing us to be able to actually help ourselves, whereas before we spent a lot of time just like shooting ourselves in the foot over and over because we could, and it just was, yeah.
Yeah. Tools are great, and obviously they're maturing and getting better, but they're always catching up to ideas. So you can't use tools as a crutch, and you really need to understand the underlying principles of what you're doing more than anything.
I think this is where a lot of what we do ties into the craft concept from earlier. Tools like Dreamweaver or Front Page tried to eliminate the coding craft from the creation of these to these products. Now our requirements around responsive, accessible, usable require us to treat the code as craft, and I think that then influences the design.
Yep. So how do you fit design into larger engineering projects, and how do you design in an agile framework?
So, I mean, like, what's
What do you think of gnashing?
Yeah.
it can be tricky because the emphasis on agile is speed and delivery, but I also think that a lot of those principles can improve design as well. Certainly, the concept of a big upfront design is something that we're trying to move away from as much as possible in favor of small iterations. Like I was saying before, I think you need some level of initial planning, obviously, to go into that initial stage, but breaking down your problems into smaller chunks and iterating on them, I think helps the agile, helps design fit into that agile process.
Great. Let's move on to some questions. If anyone in the audience has questions, or if you want to ask questions of each other, that's fine too. Joe. And then we have one back there.
I've got a whole page of things here, so sorry. No. I'll pick my favorite one, I think. So do any of you have any experience, especially from the design side, I guess, with developing a live style guide and maintaining and curating that?
Yeah.
Here, I'll do this.
Sure. Yeah, for sure. That's definitely one of the things I try to do as much as possible with every project. I do some static style guides, mood boards, that kind of thing, but one of the first things I like to do in a project is build kind of a kitchen sink page, if you will, of all the different patterns and modules, and define those abstractly in a set of style sheets. And then the individual components and implementations of the application can then extend each of those components or mix-ins or whatever they might be. So for sure, that's, at least in the last couple of years, I've been trying to do that for every project.
I find that a lot of the modern web frameworks, I'll just yell. Can you hear me? Okay. a lot of the modern web frameworks that are coming out now, React, I'm not as familiar with Angular, but React and Ember make it really easy to make live style guides because you're designing all of your functionality around components. So it's easy to just make a page that has like, okay, for this component, we're just going to throw it in with these properties and with that property so we can see the different states. And then this is just a permanent artifact. It doesn't need to be hooked up to an API. It doesn't, like, if you're designing it as an isolated component, it makes it really easy to then create that style guide. And I found it to be extremely, extremely effective for the design side of stuff, because you can have those states, like on one page, we have the 9 states of this one particular table. You know, too much, too little, empty, whatever it all is. And it's declarative too, so it's easier for designers who don't have the technical experience to come in and see, like, okay, with this data, this looks this way, and then it's just using your live code that's already unit tested and integration tested, and it's the same, and they can just tweak the styles, and I think that pattern is just awesome, and I can't wait to see what else comes out with it.
There's another question over here. Back up.
So in engineering, we have some practices that I like. They're things like test-driven development, pair programming, code reviews. Is there something analogous in the design world? And if so, how do you feel about it?
You were talking about unit testing.
Yeah, there's some stuff with the front end side of stuff. It's not very mature. It's a pain in the butt setup. So they've got what's the name of it? I forget the tool. As part of your test suite, it takes screenshots of every single interface, and then when the pixels diverge, it'll have the test fail. You have a certain amount of, like, if it changes this much, or if this thing that I thought was there is no longer there, then cause the test to fail. That stuff is still pretty, actually it's been a little while, so it could be more mature now, but it's been fresh and not very pleasant to set up, so I've just ignored it, because usually it's me doing the testing by myself, and it's easy to, refer to my own QA process. As far as pair programming, it's hard. I think that the hard part with the front end, the design stuff, and as it goes to the front end, like it's much more intuitive, and I think it's harder to communicate. Like with pair programming, you're constantly communicating. You're going back and forth. You're both holding this like mental model that you're manipulating, and for me with the design stuff, the mental model tends to be larger because usually you're approaching a whole system of interactions. So yeah, I've not done that. I would like to do that. That would be nice.
I feel like I've seen sort of an analogy to traditionally the design cred is where you have to sort of justify all of your decisions and hold them up for scrutiny. I think that's sort of the design version of the code review.
Yeah, definitely critique is kind of bread and butter to a designer. Being able to present your ideas and explain why you made those decisions. It's just kind of putting it all out there and letting feedback come as it will. Hopefully you've tested them thoroughly beforehand, and like Matt said, there isn't much automated testing at this point. It's a lot of you just kind of get a feel for how to test your own modules, put in overflow text, tiny text, make it empty, make it full, that kind of thing, and see how it behaves. Yeah, accepting feedback and not kind of pushing it away immediately is a learned skill in itself. So,
I was actually looking into some of those tools pretty recently, and they're pretty awesome and a lot easier to set up than they used to be. Of course, in sort of a real environment, it's very hard to have a controlled enough environment to be able to compare screenshots, but that's another benefit to our live pattern library, where you can actually, even if you have hundreds of patterns in there, you can sort of more quickly see what the ramifications of your changes are.
Mike, yeah, what's your question?
Hi. As for developers, are there things tooling that we can set up that make it easier for designers? Maybe stuff that they would like, or maybe stuff that would encourage them to use kind of more collaborative, agile, craft-friendly processes.
Wait, so you're asking what, I'm not sure I quite understand the question. What can developers do to make it easy for designers to engage in that sort of, or is it more to understand? Like,
Well, specifically around tooling and infrastructure and like how the code is set up. I mean, some things come to mind like SAS or less. Are there things that are helpful to be included in a project or part of a build process that make things easier that developers don't always set up or designers don't always realize we can set up for them?
I mean, you mentioned SAS and having all that kind of set up prepared is great. Things like, actually one thing that I use a lot is live reload or browser sync, tools that allow CSS and even JavaScript to be injected instantly and update the browsers automatically. Not all tools play nicely with that, but those things speed up development like huge amounts and make it extremely efficient. You make a small change, it appears instantly rather than having to rebuild and refresh and everything. So those kinds of things can be really helpful.
I think also your frameworks affect that decision a lot. Thanks. Your answer made me understand. Sorry. Like Ember, it's soup to nuts. It takes care of all the live reloading. It takes care of a lot of that stuff automatically. And so I've read a lot of stuff about how Ember is for designers or something along those lines, because it does, even though it's a big framework with a lot of decisions, it hides a lot of that. You can just look at a template. You can just edit a CSS file and be done. And React has the same stuff. It has hot reloading, and it's a little bit more to set up. It's not as, I mean, maybe there's probably some sort of boilerplate that takes care of all that, but a lot of the modern tools make that a lot easier and more straightforward.
Super. Well, it's time for lunch, so I want to thank our panelists for